Great. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. So today you have chosen to learn about procurement. So kudos, because I know it's not something that people really say, I really want to learn about procurement and I'm so excited about it, but it's a necessary evil, especially when you have EPA grants, when you want to procure things. So without further ado, as Katie said, I'm a senior planning consultant for the Center for Creative Land Recycling, CCLEAR. We are the provider for the tab provider for regions 9 and 10, but national nonprofit as far as equitable and responsible use of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. So just like Region 3, we educate and advocate WVU, so newsletters, and just to let everybody know, so in addition to Region 3 and us in Region 9 and 10, there are a lot of tab providers. So there is KSU and ICMA and NJIT and also Yukon. So there's the 10 regions of EPA. So we work very collaboratively together and we offer a bunch of things and they're all free. So if any of these are of interest to you, please reach out to Katie or anybody on their fantastic team. So today's agenda. So the first thing we're going to get into is procurement. What is it and why do we even do it? Guiding principles and regulations. Then we're going to be getting into the tenets of procurement, procurement law, IGAs, intergovernment agreements, requests for proposals, and requests for qualifications. And then we're going to be ending on developing a scope of work, evaluation, selection, and also the bid process. So that's just day one. And then day two, we'll be getting into the next section, which will be after the bid process. So without further ado, let's get into the day one agenda, which is the procurement. What is it and why do it? So what is it? Well, it's the process of obtaining products, goods or services, or to procure, right? So that's procurement. Anybody hears that word, this is what everybody's talking about. So in our case with EPA grants, as they say, right, EPA says you're going to mostly likely need to procure for professional services. Most likely that's the QEP, the Qualified Environmental Professional, right, to do ESAs, maybe some community outreach, maybe managing the grant. So there are various services that you're going to be trying to procure for, and this is what this webinar is all about. How do you do it, and how do you do it with remaining in compliance? So these two guidelines, okay, are your playbooks. They are the best resource out there for EPA's grants. So one is the EPA's practice guides. This is 27 pages. It's not very big, but it's very dense. So it's a great guide. And then the other one is the latest one, which is basically EPA's Brownfields Grants, Guidance on Competitively Procuring a Contractor. So this two-pager came out just this past spring because there was a lot of questions about the competitive procuring process, which is one of the 5 methods of procurement, which we will get into later in this session, as far as the methods of procurement. So why even do it? Well, we talked about the why, sort of, as far as the actual services and what it means. But in essence, it's to ensure that the purchases that are made are reasonably priced in a fair and open, competitive way, right? So free and open competition, that's essential. Bottom line is you have to do it. You must follow the federal requirements, right? And they're contained in the Uniform Grant Guidance, or UGG, which is kind of an appropriate acronym, right? That's published in 2 CFR Part 200, or the Super Circular as it's known. So there are other rules when administering, but this is the big kahuna, okay? And if you've never heard of 2 CFR Part 200, well, you're in for a treat. You're going to learn about it. But then you're really going to need to go into it a little bit more, because most of it is referenced in this EPA guidance document. This is a key part of procurement. It is a cross-cutting federal authority. Okay, so is it found in your cooperative agreements? Maybe referenced, maybe. Is it in your terms and conditions? Maybe. But if it's not, it doesn't matter, because it is a cross-cutting federal authority, which means that anytime you have federal money, okay, if you have a grant from Department of Transportation, an EDA grant, a HUD grant, federal money, all of it, okay, is conditioned upon cross-cutting federal authorities. 2 CFR Part 200 is one of those cross-cutting federal authorities. It applies to all federal funds, okay? It's not just EPA grants. So why do it? One answer: compliance, okay? You never want to be out of compliance, because if you're out of compliance, then you can't use your money, and sometimes you might even have to pay it back. So we all want to remain in compliance, right? And as a former brownfield practitioner, I have secured, and I've administered these grants. So I understand compliance, and I have been in the trenches. So I understand where it is. Like when you first start learning the stuff, it can be overwhelming. But I assure you, the more that you learn about it and the more that you use it and implement it, it gets easier and easier and second nature. Okay, so let's back up a bit. Guiding principles. Okay, so we have federal regulations, and that includes the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. So have you ever seen the forms that you get, and at the top they'll say OMB form 1171? Well, that's what they're referring to. It's a form that was created by the Office of Management and Budget. Okay, we'll get into them. Code of Federal Regulations. I was just talking about 2 CFR 200. That CFR means Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, we'll get into that. State, tribal, and local laws and regulations. So this is a 3-legged stool. So you have federal regulations, you have your state, tribal, and local laws regulations, and then you have your own internal policies and procedures, right? So your guiding principles and regulations, think of them as a 3-legged stool. You have to understand your federal, your state, and also your internal ones, okay? So let's talk about Office of Management and Budget. And if anybody's really, really curious, there's a hyperlink here. You can go down this, but honestly, it's basically the White House, okay? So they oversee the performance of federal agencies. Somebody's got to keep a report card, right? Well, that's OMB, okay? They want to make sure that everything that is being done is done in an effective and efficient way, because it's the taxpayers' money. So it all comes out of OMB, and these are their main functions, right? I'm not going to read their main functions, but it's just to give you an idea of who is OMB and why do we care? Well, that's the law of the land, right? The executive branch, the office, the OMB, the White House, right? Okay. So, Code of Federal Regulations. Again, here's a hyperlink if you really want to get into the whole thing about Code of Federal Regulations. But basically, it's the codification of general and permanent rules published in the Federal Register, which is really a cool thing, the Federal Register, because anything that comes out, whether it's grants or announcements or whatever, they have to be published in what's called the Federal Register, okay? So, you ever into some cool stuff? I know, I sound like a procurement geek. I pretty much am, but check out the Federal Register. Everything comes out there. So, there are 50 titles and areas of the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, and then they're broken down into chapters, right? Each agency has a chapter. EPA has Title 40, okay? And then they have various chapters, okay? So areas are 40, which is environment, and then the chapters are for like the EPA. Okay, then they're subdivided into parts, right? The various regulatory areas. So for example, 40 CFR Part 33, right? So protection of environment, that's the area. Chapter 1, the specific agency is EPA. And then you have subchapters and parts, okay? So in this instance, when you see 40 CFR Part 33, they are talking about the participation by disadvantaged business enterprises, right? DBE. Now, you probably are thinking, oh yeah, we have to do that annually, right? Well, hopefully you are thinking that because yes, there is an annual report that's part of your EPA grant, your cooperative agreement that requires you to report any DBA, or we call them MWBs, right? Minority women enterprises and disadvantaged business enterprises. So that report is an annual report and it's a requirement of your cooperative agreement. Okay, so we've talked about OMB. You know who they are. Okay, well, OMB also has uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. And that, simplified, is 2 CFR Part 200, okay? So that is broken down into the procurement standards of these parts, or subparts, I should say. And then the Part 1500 is about full and open competitive requirements, okay? So that's why it's important when you are putting out a solicitation that you say, to be followed, you know, contractor will follow all federal rules and guidelines, including 2 CFR Part 200 and 1500, right? So if they have to do sub-awards or they're getting subcontractors or something like that, that they too have to follow these guidelines. The federal award keeps going down, right? It keeps trickling down to whoever is touching the money or going to be using the money, right? They have to also follow the same regulations. It's not just you and you get your contractor and then they can do whatever. Nope, the contractor still has to follow these regulations, okay? So 40 CFR Part 33. Well, let me just say this, going back, the super circular. Back in, why do they call it the super circular, right? Is it that super? Well, I'll tell you why it's so super. So I think somebody was just being funny, but or making it fun, I guess. But back in before the super circular, okay. I'm not sure if anybody remembers this, but there used to be these circulars out of OMB, and there were 7 of them. There was like circular A81, I think it was like 22, then 52, then 88, then 121. People were like, really? You're going to keep giving these papers to us, right? So they got to 7 of them, and it was a nightmare. You were going through each one of these things, trying to figure out what all had to be followed, right? And so in 2011, during the Obama administration, they said, look, we need to combine everything to, you know, make things more efficient, effective, and so let's put them all together, and that's what we're going to do. And so basically in 2014, the super circular was born, and that's bringing all these circulars together under 2 CFR Part 200. Okay, so that's 2014, but they said, let's give people some time. So everybody had until 2017 to make sure their internal procurement policies, right, referenced 2 CFR Part 200 and not all the individual circulars, right? Okay, so I remember doing that when I was in local government, and everything had to be changed because why? Because you have to have written procurement standards, right, for all 5 procurement methods on the books. Okay, so if you ever get audited and you don't have that, there's a good chance that you will have a finding or you'll have not a material defect, but they will ding you and say, you don't have these and you need to correct this before you can utilize your grant anymore. Okay. I'm not going to go into the punishments or what they'll do, because that's up to the auditors and stuff, but make sure you have written policies and procedures. We'll be getting into that later. So, 40 CFR Part 33, right? I talked a little bit about this, about the DBE. So this is really important. I can't stress this enough, and we'll get into this in just 1 second, as far as the actual language that has to go into each contract that you actually have with a contractor. But DBEs they have to have the opportunity to compete for the procurement, right? And again, you have to document the methods. So in Appendix A to 40 CFR 33, it requires procurement contracts to include the following, okay? This language is so important that I'm going to give you like a second here. In fact, I may just read it here. But the contractor shall not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, or sex in the performance of this contract. The contractor shall carry out applicable requirements of 40 CFR Part 33 in the award and administration of contracts awarded under EPA financial assistance agreements. Failure by the contractor to carry out these requirements is a material breach of this contract, which may result in the termination of this contract or other legally available remedies, okay? So EPA is telling you that this is a requirement in your contracts, okay? So if anything, just remember this, all right? Make sure you have this in your contracts. Okay, gonna move on. So in a nutshell, guiding principles and regulations. So first and foremost, okay, read your cooperative agreement. Now, for those of you who already have a cooperative agreement or are thinking about getting an EPA grant, right? Once you get awarded and you go through and you get a work plan, it gets approved, and finally you get your approved cooperative agreement. You know this because you get a BF number, B as in boy, F as in Frank, and then a number. I think it's like 7 digits. Anyway, that is your grant number. That goes to the cooperative agreement. Okay, so there's the cooperative agreement, and then you have terms and conditions, 2 separate documents. Again, hyperlinked here. It's less than 200 pages, but this has loads of stuff in here that you need to know because you're required to do these things, okay? So if you say, wow, I didn't see that in the cooperative agreement, chances are that it's in the terms and conditions. And these terms and conditions are usually across the board for all federal grants, and they get into those cross-cutting authorities, okay? So know your rules, right? Read it, know it, live it. It's as simple as that. Again, it seems like a lot now, and but the more that you do it, the more that it becomes second nature. So consult, right? Consult with your EPA project manager, officer, your governing body, your legal advisors, right? These are serious contracts, okay? And if there's a must or required, you need to pay attention to those things. Seek out mentors, your brownfield buddies. Seek out people who already have these grants and are managing them and have had many of them and are really successful, right? I have brownfield buddies. They're great, especially in the beginning. I've been doing this for many, many years, and I couldn't have done it without those, those people. So it takes a village, of course. You can't do this alone. Don't rush it. If you're guessing at things, it gets really, really dicey, and you just don't want to go down that road. Just ask. You have a grant specialist. If you have a grant right now, you have a grant specialist. They are definitely one of the first things they say in this document. This is that EPA best practice guide for procuring services. On the first page and in the first paragraph, they say in bold, If you have questions regarding any of the matters addressed in this guidance, EPA encourages you to contact your grant specialist. They are a great resource, so utilize them, okay? Utilize your tab providers, right? They can help, and if they can't, they don't know the answer, they will find the person or the resource for you. Okay, so moving on. Now we're going to get into the tenets of procurement and the CLAW and all these other documents as far as the IJs, RFPs, and RFQs. What are they? What are the differences? So, tenets of procurement. First and foremost, people joke about this, but I am the why person. I always ask people, why are you doing it? Whether it's a webinar or whether it's applying for a grant, why are you doing this? Why are you having a community meeting? You need to know what you need and what you want. And usually that comes from community meetings, talking to stakeholders. You're really doing some active listening. And then you go, you know what? We need an EPA grant. Okay. So then when it comes to procurement, why are you procuring? Why do you need a qualified environmental professional? Well, we can't do environmental site assessments. Okay. All right. But are you just doing environmental site assessments? What are you trying to get out of those environmental site assessments? Okay. So have a very, very clear understanding of what you need and want, because that will tie into the scope of work, which we'll be talking about in a bit. Okay. Know your rules and regulations as far as the procurement process itself. Understand your timeline and the process. If you don't need a QEP right away, concentrate more on your brownfield stakeholder or your internal capacity before you go out for a QEP or a contractor. If you're, rushing that and you're not ready to manage a contractor, which will be day 2's talk, then you're just rushing. You have, most of these grants are 3 years. Some of them are even more, right? But typically they used to be 3 years. Now they're 4 or even 5 years old. You've got time. If somebody's telling you that you have to get a QEP right away, especially with these new grants, it's okay. Take your time. EPA, definitely, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I've spoken to lots of project managers who all say the same thing. We'd rather you be prepared and ready to handle a contractor than just hiring one just to hire one. And just checking off a box, right? You want to know, and they also want to know when you hire them, what is it that you need me to do? What are your expectations, right? You need to understand all of that before you go out to procure, okay?
Hey,
So,
Joelle.
yeah.
Hey, Joelle. We have a question in the chat real quick. So Savannah wonders if we have our own procurement policies that are less stringent than UGG for non-federal funds. Does that satisfy the requirement to have written procurement policies? Or do our written procurement policies have to be aligned with the UGG?
The latter. So right down here, the last bullet, great question. You must conduct your procurement in accordance with the minimum UGG requirements, even if your own procurement system has less stringent standards. If they're more stringent, good to go. If they're less stringent, for example, let's say that you have a you need to go out for at least 2 weeks, right? It's published for 2 weeks. And that's what you say, 15 days, right? Federal grant guidelines, these UGG, is a minimum of 30 days. So that's more stringent. So your internal procurement process may say 15 days or even 3 weeks, but the UGG says a minimum of 30 days. Therefore, you need to go out for a minimum of 30 days. Does that answer the question?
Just as a clarification, Savannah said she gets the procurement has to be conducted with UGG, but for the other requirement, to have written procurement policy, does any procurement policy work in the context of an audit?
EPA's guidelines. I mean, every auditor you want to say has the same standards. EPA's guidelines basically state that in each one of these, we'll go over these policies, each policy, like conflict of interest, right? There is a minimum set in the UGG. If your internal policies meet or more strict than those that the UGG state, I would say you're fine. But if yours are less, or you don't have something addressing one of the minimum requirements, honestly, I would do an internal audit, like your own audit of your policies and procedures, and go line by line and say, okay, we have this, we've addressed this, whoop, we're missing this. So now we need to put this in here. We have this, but they don't, but we can keep it or not keep it, right? I think you're going to have to do your own internal review using the best practice guide to make sure that you meet the minimum requirements. Does that address?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, but great question. So make sure you have your procurement team, and we'll get into this a little bit at the end, as well as, you know, you have reviewers and evaluators, and actually a facilitator that is not reviewing, but they're facilitating the process, right? To keep it very unbiased, right? And the people who are doing the reviewing are knowledgeable about what you're actually procuring for. They don't have to be experts, but something that has some type of connection, okay? This is probably one of the most important things, is that you have to document. You have to make sure that it's defensible, and that what you've documented clearly shows a person, if you were audited, your process, how you selected the consultant, answered the questions, had open, was out for, and you can print, various, your publication, and make sure you have copies of the solicitation, the evaluations, the score sheets, all that stuff you need to keep. Okay. You can't over document. Well, I guess sometimes you could over document. You don't have to have word for word, but it's kind of like the meeting minutes, right? Just enough to show that you did everything that you were supposed to do. Okay. All right. We've already talked about conducting procurement in accordance with the minimum UGG. So moving on. So here are the UGG standards. Okay. Not all of them, but these are the big ones, right? Written procurement policies and procedures, covering the methods available under the regulations. And that we're going to get into, and it's called the procurement clause. It's the 5 methods under 2 CFR 200. Okay. The cost must be reasonable and necessary. Okay. If you were to go out and do a community meeting, and you spent $60,000 on it, right? Was the meeting necessary? And were the costs reasonable, right? This is, if it's justified and you've documented everything, then it was a community meeting that was $60,000, okay? But if you didn't do that, then someone may say, I don't think this was very reasonable, right? So full and open competition, right? This gets into when you are evaluating or putting out a solicitation, and you might narrow the scope by saying something like, we're looking for a contractor who has worked with EPA Brownfields grants. Okay. You cannot say that. Okay. That is not one of the evaluation criteria. You need to just say someone who has experience with contaminated properties, because there could be someone who is just as equally that has done environmental site assessments. They just haven't worked with brownfield grants, right? So that clarification came out in the most recent competitively procuring contractor guidance just this past spring. So written standards, already talked about that for procuring, but also for internal and external conflicts of interest. They go over that in detail in that first guidance that I showed you from EPA. You must maintain documentation addressing cost and price analysis, okay, and vendor selection where applicable based on the method of procurement. So the cost and price analysis is, they actually go over this in the appendix of this guide about cost and price analysis. Think of it this way. You say, Joelle, I don't do environmental site assessments. How would I do this before procurement? Okay. Well, if you moved to a different state, say I wanted to move to Alaska and I wanted to buy a home, and I would get on, I don't know, Zillow, Redfin, Realtor.com, and I would check out the house prices. What could I afford, right? And I see after a bit that most houses in a particular area, maybe it's Anchorage, maybe it's Juneau, are around, I don't know, 500,000-600,000. Okay, well, that gives me an idea of what to expect in that area that I want to move to. Okay, so when I see a house pop up and it's $1.2 million, that either comes with a private butler or something, or a pool and a jacuzzi, and it's right on the water or something. But if it's nothing like that and it looks like everything else, it might seem unreasonable, right? Okay. Same thing with ESAs. There is that, or contractors, you're basically going out and doing something like that, whether it's talking with a contractor, not one that's going to bid, but like getting ideas of what the price and costs are, right, that are out there. Most of you know that phase ones are usually under $5,000 typically. Phase twos, well, who knows, right? But you also know that probably a junior scientist or a technical person, or maybe a senior person, there is a rate, that is reasonable, as opposed to $550 an hour, right? So the cost and price analysis has to be done prior to going out for your solicitation. And it doesn't have to be huge, but it is all covered in this guide, okay?
Hey, Joelle.
Yeah.
We got another question in the chat.
Sure.
In our evaluation, can we give more points to a vendor with EPA experience, since they are already familiar with the numerous rules we have to follow, as long as we allow anyone to bid? Specifically asking from an RLF perspective, where the QEP is more focused on ensuring compliance with the EPA rules than doing environmental site assessments.
Great question. My understanding is no, you cannot. I will get into the various aspects. So what there in this 2-pager that came out, the evaluation criteria, which we will cover in a bit, but EPA recommends that the reasonableness of cost price proposals is at least 25% of the total percentage, right? When you're going out and you're doing that evaluation, right? So they said this factor may be evaluated at the same time as other factors for all the bids, or only evaluated for 2 or more top scoring bids. So when they're saying, as far as, for example, responsible, like demonstrated experience in addressing contaminated properties, demonstrated experience in successfully completing tasks and projects, demonstrated experience in effectively engaging with community members, experience and capacity of project team personnel. So they can't be so specific that they would restrict that open competition, right? Now, a little aside about RLFs, having managed an RLF myself, QEPs are usually something that come from, I don't know, come from the project, or somebody's coming to you asking for cleanup funds, right? So usually you're going to have an outside, municipality or an organization that's coming to you saying, hey, we have this project, we need cleanup dollars, or there's the developer that says, hey, I need cleanup dollars and I'm going to need a loan, and I heard you have an RLF, yada, yada. At that point, the project already has an APCA, they already have a cleanup plan, they're coming to you for funds, right? Typically, they already have a contractor in place for that work. So just to make sure, as far as, I guess that gets into, and you can talk to Katie more, or, the WVU or your tab provider, as far as why you have a QEP on the RLF, but you cannot restrict it to, my understanding is from Jim Drummond, who is the EPA procurement guru guy, that restricting it like that is not acceptable. Does that answer the question? Okay. So I'm just going to read the note on this guidance that came in the spring that says, if you have already selected a contractor, but the procurement process did not incorporate the factors outlined above, then the process you completed to select a contractor may not have been compliant with the federal regulations in 2 CFR Part 200 and 2 CFR Part 1500. If this happened, it would be prudent to immediately notify your EPA project officer for guidance. Additionally, please note that you may need to prepare and issue a new RFP, RFQ that is compliant with federal procurement regulations to avoid an adverse finding in an audit or other review of your cooperative agreement. So when I say this stuff is very important, it is very important, okay? Having said that, we're going to move on to the procurement clause. We can come back for more questions. The procurement clause, this clause was developed by OMB. And by now you all know who OMB is. So OMB produced this clause to make it easier for people to remember. There are 5 procurement methods. Micro purchases, which we all know, right? They're under $10,000. Micro purchases actually used to be, I believe, $3,000 or $3,500. It was really small, right? And no, you cannot do micro purchase agreements like, oh, we'll just keep doing $10,000, right? It has to be distinct and separate, and there are definitely things that go with the micro purchase agreement, okay? So do not try to do a bunch of micro purchase agreements, and then, when you get audited, they're like, so this actually should have just been competitively procured, or, done a different way, but you can't utilize micro purchases like that either. Small purchases, sealed bids, competitive proposals, which is usually where we land with our EPA grants, because they're based on services, right? They're not based on a fixed price, even though it kind of sounds like it, because you have a specific, grant funding or contractual amount. Sealed bids are typically for construction projects. Okay, so competitive proposals is usually where we land here. But could you use micro purchase? Sure, for a specific thing that you have that doesn't really fit into anything else, right? Like maybe you need a little something for community outreach, right? Just maybe not marketing, but outreach, a facilitator or something like that. And it's going to be under $10,000. Maybe micro purchase would be that, way to go, right? And you have a quick time frame. Sole source, maybe you're in an area or there's a specific thing that you need, bioremediation regarding around landfills, and it's so specific that there's only one contractor that fits the bill, right? Sole source is very, very rare. Again, I'm putting up the two guidelines again, hyperlinked. Sole source is very, very rare. There are 4, only one source has goods. It's an emergency. You have EPA approval, or after soliciting a number of sources, it was deemed competition was inadequate. Again, it can't just be, yep, one of those was an emergency. It was an emergency because of, and you have to document what that emergency was and provide, you know, all the justifications behind the sole source. Okay. So we're not going to go all through all these, but OMB, this is the procurement clause, just to keep everything, you know, easily remembered as far as the 5 ways to procure. Okay. The 250,000 is over 250,000 fixed price. So cost reimbursement, and typically for acquisition of services where qualifications and technical approaches may be more important than price considerations. Okay. So, that's where we typically land with EPA grants. So are there other ways besides procurement? Yes, there's this thing called an intergovernment agreement. So a lot of states, right, state agencies have lists or contractors that they've already procured for, right? They've already done procurement, they've gotten, they've qualified these contractors, and now they have a list, right? Okay, so I know in Idaho, they have a list of contractors, and they do this, I think every year they go out and they have a procurement process that's competitive, right? So what they're saying is if you had, right, if I was, let's say, the city of Ponderay, and I had an intergovernment agreement with the state of the Idaho State DEQ, right, Department of Environmental Quality, that said, we have this understanding and we will be utilizing your contractor list for, you know, our EPA grant or whatever it is, right? You show a written IGA, right? That's in place. Then, according to 2 CFR 318E, right? You may piggyback off that list without further competition, okay? This is a really, really great tool, and EPA actually goes into it and they encourage it, okay? So if anybody's interested in that, I'm going to be lifting up this thing over and over again in this session. So if we were live, I'd be probably walking around with it. So don't forget this, it can take away a lot of the headache. All right. So let's get into the RFPs, RFQs. So one is a request for proposal. In that case, you get one firm and you get proposals, right? Okay. In the other instance, you get request for qualifications. And that is basically you're asking for qualifications. And while both must account for reasonableness of cost and price, an RFQ, you get a stable of consultants, right? Now, you say, Joelle, why would I want a stable of consultants? I got one. Do I want to manage 5? No, you're not managing 5. What you're doing is you're having a stable of consultants such that if you have sites or if you have projects that have maybe lead and asbestos, maybe there are PCBs, maybe there are, maybe you need community outreach, maybe you need facilitators, maybe you need reuse planning, maybe you need visioning exercises, right? Some of these things tab providers can help you with too for free. But maybe you need a stable of consultants to choose from. Maybe one gets so, busy that they can't do a rapid site assessment for you, and now you have to wait, right? And time is not on your side. That's an issue, but you only have one firm. okay? RFQs, I've done them both ways. I prefer an RFQ only because I have choices. And so if you're in that situation, you might want to check out the request for qualifications, okay? And then what you would get back are what's called SOQs, or statement of qualifications. But you must account for the reasonableness of cost and price, okay? You cannot leave cost and price out of a request for qualifications, okay? So when I was talking about the, doing that, the price analysis before you go out. So I talked about the guide, the Appendix A. Here we go again. I'm going to hold it up in this document, the first EPA practice. That is in the back in A, gives you a step-by-step process on how to do it. Also, there's this neat little tool out by Lattice Community called the Analysis of Brownfields Costs, and there's a hyperlink here. Here you can put in the state, what you're looking for, phase ones, maybe there's a other specific thing, phase twos. They've got all their information from Acres. And Acres is the database that you put all your brownfield site information for the EPA grants, into Acres. Anyway, they culled information from that, and they came up with this brilliant tool that gives you an idea of what costs would be around certain things, like a phase one, right? So that is a great tool to help with, helping you figure out that cost price analysis, okay? So the do's and don'ts, all right? These are the quick and dirty, right? First of all, do not seek or accept any guidance or anything with from any contractors who are thinking about bidding on your project. Not even, hey, what happened when you did blah, blah, blah? Did you, do you have any examples or things that you responded to that you thought was a really good? No, just don't even have the conversation, okay? Don't use sample language, not even if they give it to you for free. Like if you get it in your email from them, just delete it. If you use anything like that, if you borrow from somebody or you see it from somebody, you might want to call them and say, hey, just wondering, did you guys develop this yourself, or did you get it from, where did you get it from? Okay. Kind of like social media, right? You got to figure out where things are coming from. Has it been, was it developed by a contractor that may be bidding on your project, but didn't bid on their project? Okay. So do not include any language that restricts or limits the competition, right? Or gives a particular contract an advantage. You may not even know that you're giving someone an advantage, but all the contractors do out there. It's a very small world. Okay. Do not include a copy of the work plan in the RFP, RFQ if you received assistance from a contractor in developing it and they plan to bid on the RFP, RFQ, okay? So this is really key. The work plan, say a contractor helped you with developing a work plan, and they can, but most contractors don't want to do that because they want to bid on the work. But if they helped you with the work plan, then they can't bid on the work. All right. So it's also protecting you. It's also protecting them too. All right. So 4 rules just to make sure that you don't violate any of those besides all the other ones. Okay. Here's the big one. Okay. So Katie wanted me to talk to you about this because this has been a topic of discussion for probably 2 years now. Can you do an RFP for writing a grant and implementation of services? I would love to do a poll right now to see what everybody on this phone call would say. And here's the answer. Yes, however, and now I sound like an attorney, and I'm not an attorney, okay? This is a yes. However, cost price reasonableness must be a factor on everything being solicited, including writing the grant. And as you already know, an EPA grant cannot pay for the grant writing, all right? Anything to do with the application, okay? So even like pre-award costs or anything, like nothing. The grant cannot pay for those, their ineligible activities. Okay. So that has to be in the proposal as far as what is being solicited. They've got to give those cost proposals. It's free and open competition. Can't be written, right? We've all seen this. Evaluation must have a cost criteria. And if it's percentages, it must be at least 25%. I should say EPA encourages it to be more than 25% when you have 100 points, right? The using percentages. Okay. And of course, it must adhere to all of the guidelines. All right. So last part, developing the scope of work. Now, I'm sure most of you understand SOWs, not that SOW, but not that SOW. But what is it? Well, the SOW is basically describing what you all need, right? What is it? You know, remember when we were talking about the needs of your community and the goals and making sure that they tie to your work plan and what you actually need to be successful with your grant, right? So what are the components of a really good scope of work? Project goals, timeline, always good to have timelines and benchmarks and deadlines, right? Expected results. We are expecting to have at least a cleanup plan. And in order to do that, we need to have things delineated. We just can't have a yep or no, right? We can't just have, yeah, you thought that there was petroleum at this former gas station. You were right. No, we need delineation. We need to know more than that. We need to know where the gradients are and how the water is flowing, right? Deliverables, okay? What kind of deliverables? What format? You know, what exactly is it that deliverable will give you in order to get you to maybe the next grant that you want to write? Maybe you want to write a cleanup grant. You know, just make sure that those steps take you to the next point. All right. Conditions, management conditions, as far as like, hey, if this were to happen, then this needs to happen, right? Again, a good scope of work really just outlines everything that your contractor needs to know in order to deliver what you need, right? So put yourself in their position and not just, you know, we just need some ESAs, some phase 1, some phase 2s, some community outreach, and maybe some reuse planning, right? Be a little bit more, be a lot more detailed, descriptive. Go back to your work plan goals, go back to your application and see what it is that you told them that you want, your outcomes, right? Not your outputs. Of course, you need to do how many phase 1s, you know, the number of things, the metrics, but it's the outcomes that you want to do, right? Those resulting, like we want to have more recreational acreage. We want to have more mixed use development in this corridor, right? Whatever that is, make sure that is tied into your SOW, okay? So we've already talked about why it's important. So boundaries, make sure that your scope has boundaries. What's in, what's not in. This is also good for your consultant because there's what's called scope creeping. If you forget something and it's outside of the scope of work, that is outside of the scope of work and it's outside of the contract, and therefore it can be an additional charge. That contractor is totally within their rights to say, hey, that's outside of the scope, right? And therefore we need to either amend this contract or we don't do it, right? Okay, so that's why the SOW is so important, okay? Making sure tasks and responsibilities both for the client and services, right? So who's doing what, you know, when and how it's going to be done, right? The why is the purpose, and the how and the what is all about results and the process, okay? So just keep that in mind. Making sure everybody has clear expectations. Everybody's on the same page, all right? There's nothing worse than everybody being on separate pages and not understanding that, oh, you said you wanted clear communication. that means to me, I need to have, when I call you or reach out to you, I need you to respond to me within 24 hours, even if it's just super busy. Can I get back to you next Monday morning? Cool, not a problem, right? So it's as it's as detailed as that, right? What's your communication plan, your channels, your frequency? If you're going to have team meetings, is it enough to say team meetings, or we're going to have 4 team meetings? When, right? Just make sure you have that. And of course, quality assurance. What are the standards? Are you getting it back in, PDF? Are you getting it in Word? Are you getting in some format that you can actually use, edit? Legal and compliance is always part of it, right? And appendices. So everything that you need should be in there so that it informs both you and also the people who are bidding on it. So, talked a little bit about this already. Does the scope of work align with your overall goals and your work plan? Really go back. If ever in doubt, go back to your application and reread it. If you weren't the one that wrote it, please read your application first before you even get into your cooperative agreement. It'll give you that breadth of knowledge that gives you, it sets the stage and everything. So you'll be happy that you did it. I took over from someone who had been doing it for years, and I had 6 grants and an RLF. And honestly, after I read all the applications, then I was like, okay, now I understand the why for all these grants, because I thought I was going crazy with, 7 grants. Who would have 7 grants at one time, right? So it's possible. So anyway, reusing a SOW. Kind of already talked about this. If you do reuse it, make it your own. Tailor it to your needs. Every community is different. All the needs are different. The grants are different, right? Make sure that it just aligns with everything that you're trying to do. Okay, so I kind of already talked about this, but it's not just enough, hey, give me a phase 2. A phase 2 is only going to tell you whether something is there or not there, right? If you want something delineated, you need to say, something about, will we know enough in order to know where we have to place the monitoring wells to determine the direction of groundwater flow? Will we know enough about offsite contamination? So that we could maybe have some estimates of cleanup costs, right? So that we have just enough to evaluate the remediation options. Okay, that last one is really key. It's kind of one of my favorites to put into phase 2s. So building a solicitation. Okay, these are the main components of building a solicitation. So you have your introduction, which you can, just say, we're looking for this, and we are looking for, we have a Brownfields grant. It's okay to say that we have a Brownfields grant, right? Because that's what you have. And you're not looking for someone who is, who has done or worked with a Brownfields grant. You just say, we have a Brownfields grant, and this is what we want to do with it, right? Here's the scope of work that we need from you in order to get to our goals, right? The terms, the conditions, the expectations, right? We already went over that. Here is the budget, right? Or everybody talks about budget, right? Okay, so you're not telling them, you're asking them for a budget, right? But I will tell you already that your grant and the awards, right, are public. In fact, August 31st, they all go down. So EPA actually has a site. If you Google FY23 MARC grants, MARC, which stands for Multi-Purpose Assessment Revolving Loan Fund and Cleanup Grants, right? MARC grants. If you Google FY23 MARC recipients or awards, EPA, you'll get to a landing page where it lists out all the recipients, right? And a copy of their grant in PDF format, even the folks who were not successful. So all those budgets, right? If you went for a $2 million assessment grant, you got the grant, they know you have $2 million. Well, they know that Some will go into community, some will go into personnel and fringe and yada, 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 right? But for the most part, they know that there's a good chunk of money there under contractual, right? Okay. So it's not a huge secret is what I'm getting at. All right. Not like construction bids, which is why they use a sealed bid process. Okay. So, experience and qualifications. I think that says it all, right? So part of the solicitation is knowing the experience, the qualifications, how long the team has worked together, right? Not just individually, but how long have they all been together working on a project? Submission requirements, right? The typical, when is it due? The deadlines, is there interviews, the format, the evaluation criteria is very important, right? The project timetable, letting them know what your benchmarks are. What are the deadlines? What are the things that you want to get done? You want to get your phase ones done in the first, year. The second and third year, you want to move on to some reuse planning, some phase 2 stuff. Maybe you want to do some visioning. Community engagement is all throughout. And of course, the attachments, anything that locally, right? This is when your internal policies come in, is there like anti-lobbying and conflicts of interest and anything else that you have? Attachments, right? Okay. So let's get into the big question, right? Not the big question, but the big chunk of a solicitation. And that is evaluation and selection, right? Most contractors, scope of work right there. Okay. And then they're going to go right to the evaluation selection. What are you going to grade me on? Okay. So we sort of talked about this a little, and this is where the example is in this 2-pager, that EPA in the spring. I've listed them out here. And the way that they're listed is the demonstrated experience, right? With contaminated properties, with community engagement, the capacity. I talked about, successfully completing tasks and projects. Are you on budget? Are you on time? Do you have a lot of change orders, right? I can remember hiring the least, right? So my select board was like, we have to go with the lowest price. Okay. Well, we went after the lowest price. We're going to the lowest price. So it always was the same contractor. Well, that same contractor also did a lot of change orders, and I kept track of them. Okay. So then when the next time there was a solicitation, right, for work, and they were part of that RFQ, but they still had to put in that task order, and their bid was this. I said to everyone, hey, I just want you to know that on that last one, they actually turned out to be the most expensive contractor because of all the change orders, right? Okay. So just be wary of that as far as, it's almost like a deposition, right? You only will get the answers that you need if you ask the right questions, which is why evaluations are so key and the scope of work is so key, because you have to ask and delineate what the things that you really are looking for so that you get the right fit, right? Okay. Let's do a little exercise, right? It's 12:05. We're almost done. Okay. So let's look at this evaluation. Adds up to 100 points. Can somebody tell me if this is good or not? Would this pass the muster if you got audited? Anybody can answer. Even you, Katie.
And feel free to unmute yourselves if you would like. I see in the chat, Savannah said no because of experience with EPA grants.
Good job, Savannah, but I think you had a little head start there, right? But yes, absolutely. That is absolutely a problem. Okay. Anything else? Here's a clue. There is one more.
Savannah also said price reasonableness should be at least 25.
Good job, Savannah. Exactly. So it should be at least 25. I've seen it be as high as 35. Okay. 25 is good. And in fact, you know, depending on what the needs were here for this, and was this an actual example? Yes, this was an actual example. So you're in good company. There are lots of folks across the country who think that they have been doing things exactly the way that they should be doing it, right? But these sessions and webinars are here to educate folks so that they understand what the guidelines are, so that we can get back to a place where everybody's in compliance. They're doing things the way that are in line with 2 CFR 200, and also your own internal procedures, so that the next line of folks right behind you, or whoever's doing it now or in the future, knows the proper way of doing these things, so that everything is copacetic if you ever get audited. Okay, so good job. The bid process, last part. So the bid process, kind of went over a lot of this, but this is it all in a nutshell, right? Make sure you have open and free competition. You're going to publish them according to the procurement guidelines, minimum of 30 days. So let's talk about publishing. Okay, some states have state bid platforms where you can put it out and then it's like open to everyone, right? Also in your own internal policies and procedures, it's going to say where you would publish them. Maybe it's at your library kiosk. Maybe it is in your local newspaper. Maybe it's on your website, right? Is it okay to email it to someone specifically? Well, you could let them know that it is up and out there, right? Because they've asked, or somebody, you know, has, you know, that they are specifically really good at that, maybe lead abatement, and you have a lot of properties that have lead. You know, if personally, I would probably just be like, hey guys, it's up, you know, RFP is up on our website, you know, let everybody know, but, you know, just make sure that you're doing it for everyone, right? That doesn't mean you have to email all these contractors. Most people have said that, well, I've emailed 3, you know, saying, hey, this is out there, you've asked about it, but it's out there, right? And then they take the email and they print it out and they put it in their file, showing that, you know, they sent it to more than just one, right? Okay. So, but if you put on your website, you put it on the state, you're doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, publishing it the way that the guidelines also say, and per your internal, you should be good to go. All right. Point of contact, one person, right? This is a big one. Instructions and questions. I've actually seen where RFPs have had to go out again, or at least extend, because someone asked a question, they answered it, but they didn't provide the answer to everyone. Okay. So this is very important. So the best thing is to gather all the questions at once, and then have all the answers go out, and then say, you know, there's a question and answer period time. So the solicitation goes out on X date, and then you have questions from here to here, you know, the next week, and then they're closed, no more questions, right? And then you have a time period, and then, sorry, deadline, 5 o'clock, Eastern Standard Time, Pacific Time, whatever it is, make sure you put that time zone, right? And then, you know, how is it being accepted? Electronically, paper? I've seen where people accept it electronically, but then they go and their reviewers are like, well, I want it in paper. I get sick, you know, going through all this stuff on my computer. My eyes can't deal with that. So now all of a sudden you're printing off all these proposals, right? If you don't want to incur that, then you might want to say, how many copies do you need? Okay. So, I, of course, try to save paper as much as I can. So anyway, so instructions and questions, we've gone over that. Make sure that you give them to everyone. And then, of course, interviews if necessary. Sometimes it's a clear winner, right? But the interviews allow you a time where you can actually request, or you meet the person who's going to be the project manager, the person you're going to be working with the most. Meeting the principal of that firm is not going to do you any good, right? You want to meet the person who you're going to be working with very closely, because this grant is a long time, right? And of course, my favorite is that if there's a change in personnel, make sure that there's something in the contract that says, should there be a change in personnel, you'll let me know ASAP, and any onboarding, getting up to speed is not going to be at the expense of, of us, right? It's on you to get them up to speed, right? And that is it. So here we go. All together. Know and follow the rules and regulations. Have written internal procurement P&Ps. Gold star, Savannah, written P&Ps. SOW well-defined and aligns with goals of work plan, project, and community. Solicitation is the correct one, and that you have procurement, policies and everything like that for all the 5 methods. Evaluation is clear, right? Weighted and no restrictions. Solicitation abides by all the rules as far as timing and getting out the questions and the answers, right? And it's published correctly. All right. So having said all this, that's the whole process of procurement. And then the next time we get together, we'll talk about when you actually get the proposals in and what you do and go from there with them. Okay.
Thanks, Joelle, and thank you everyone for attending today. We hope you found this informative, and thanks for asking questions. Just because one person asked the question certainly means traditionally a lot of other folks had that same question. So again, thank you, and we appreciate the time you took. So at this time, we'll just open this up to see if anyone else has any questions.
I'm curious. It's Savannah. Hello.
Savannah.
You said that example of the scoring criteria was an actual example from a recipient. What happened to that recipient when it was found that it was done incorrectly?
I'm not sure if I'm at liberty to say.
Okay.
I will have to say nobody had to pay any money back, but I believe they had to stop the contract and reissue.
Okay.
So I will say this, Katie, I'm sure I don't know, you've seen these and everything, but the EPA regions are I'd like to say that they're all the same and they do everything the same. They decide things the same. Unfortunately, sometimes they're not always on the same page, and it really depends on who is actually reviewing and doing the audit, honestly. So I've seen where folks are just like, okay, well, it is what it is. You've already spent money, and you know what? You're going to then correct things. So you're going to show us how in your policies and procedures, and they kind of put a freeze, they call it an administrative condition on your cooperative agreement, and it comes out of the grants management office, and they basically put this like a lien on your grant type of thing. And they basically say, you're going to need to provide us with a plan, right? A corrective plan that shows us how your internal policies and procedures have been corrected so that this never happens again. And then you show them that, and then that gets lifted, and then you can move on to, administer your grant. Great question, though.
Okay, if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out and email us. We'll certainly make sure that Joelle gets that, and you can email Joelle directly. Again, feel free to do that. And as she mentioned, she will be covering more next week. So same time, same channel, 10 o'clock, or yeah, 11 o'clock. Sorry, I lost track of time. So, grab your lunch, be ready to go. Do want to ask that if you could take this poll, that'd be really helpful for us. It helps us understand if in fact this webinar was helpful. Certainly if there's anything we could do to adjust that. So appreciate the time. Next slide.
I think, Katie, since the poll is up, it won't let me advance the slides.
Okay.
So I'm going to hit the share results. Okay.
All right. It should be good now.
So if I can close the post webinar poll, I think I can probably.
All right, so we just want to give you a little more information about how TAB can help. Joelle, again, does it on the West Coast, and we are here for the Mid-Atlantic region. So again, all of our services are free, and key resources that we provide include brownfield education, such as webinars like this, resource identification, so that includes assisting with reviewing grant applications and preparing for them, and resource roadmaps, and then local brownfield program support. So if you want to identify brownfield sites in your community and prepare an inventory of those, if you have any questions on specific sites, we can help you with that. And then also when it comes to project development and design assistance, that is something we could help you with as well. If you want to go through the visioning process for a site and maybe look to get a concept plan that can help you establish that vision and get everyone on the same page, we can certainly help. Next slide. We want to let you know about some things coming up here in EPA Region 3. For those of you in West Virginia, or those of you who are close, the West Virginia Brownfield Conference is going to be coming up on September 12th through the 14th. There's still time to register. It's going to be up in Wheeling at Ogilvie Park. It's a fantastic facility. So the facility is wonderful, and the content and folks there are even better. So if you can attend or would find that helpful, we encourage you to do so. And of course, just a reminder for next week's webinar, again, since you signed up for today, you do have the link for next week. But if you think any of your friends would enjoy this fun, please feel free to share so that they can come next week, and they could also review the recording for today in case they missed it. Also want to let you know that we are working with states in Region 3, and so we will be holding some state-specific grant webinars coming up in October. So far, we have dates secured for Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And so we're still working to see if we're going to line those up for the other states as well. So look for registration there on the same link that you would have used, or similar link that you would have used to find today's webinar. So all of that is coming up, and this is how you can reach us. I realize that this still has the Twitter bird. Rest in peace. So we'll update and add the X sometime. But, for those of you who are a little more conventional, there's our email address for myself and Becca, who kept all the wheels on track here. So we certainly appreciate all of her efforts. And then Carrie's laying low behind the scenes, but she's leading the charge here. So if you have any questions, or you want to schedule a one-on-one consultation, reach out and let us know. So we hope you all enjoyed the session, and we sure hope to see you next week. And Joelle, thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for all the great questions. And yeah, this is hopefully wasn't too dry for everyone, but you've taken the first step in understanding procurement. So good luck with everything, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.